Dragon Ballers, if you're looking to buy Dragon Ball Super or One Piece sealed product, make sure to get 5% off using my link to Mystic TCG down in the description. You can also sell cards to them using their Facebook link, which is also down in the description. Yo, what's going on, One Piecers? Welcome back to another video. In today's video, I want to do a competitive guide to playing red in the One Piece card game. Now, if you guys don't know me from Dragon Ball Super, my channel is usually very competitive focused. Whenever I do a meta analysis or talk about cards, I'm usually talking about them in the competitive sense. And of course, you can play a game like One Piece casually with your friends at home or at your locals, but this video is going to be for players who already know how to play the game and have a deck built, but want to get better at playing the color red, because there's a lot of nuance in this game and in this color that you won't just learn out of nowhere. It helps to have someone point it out, especially if you're not super adept at card games or if you're new to card games. For a lot of people, One Piece is their first card game, so I think this video will be pretty helpful to a lot of you guys, especially with Treasure Cups coming up. But anyways, we will get into this video. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe, hit that bell so you never miss a video, and let's just get started. So obviously, when we're talking about red, we're talking about two leaders. That is Luffy and Zoro. Whichever leader you pick, a lot of these tips we talk about in this video are gonna overlap, but I'll make sure to point out specific ones to each leader. The main difference in the leaders are kind of the value they bring to the table. So Zoro gives you a board-wide buff of 1k as long as he has a Don attached, but Luffy is able to equip rested Don, so you get a bit more value out of the Don you use in that specific turn, especially when you combine, the equipping one-drop Namis with Luffy's effect. Those are the main differences, but a lot of what you play in your main deck is going to overlap, so we're going to talk more about that as we go through. Now, getting into those main deck cards, let's start with part one of this video. And what part one is what I'm going to call our starter cards, and I'll explain what that means in a second. So Nami is probably the perfect example of a starter card. She's a one drop that searches for the vast majority of our deck. Most red players are playing a vast majority of Straw Hat cards. Nami can find those cards, and you want to start every single turn one with her. That's pretty obvious. Then we have other starter cards that are probably a bit more relevant to Zoro, and those are Sunny-kun and Vivi. These are just cheap attackers, and that's the name of the game with red, right? You are playing the most aggressive color in the game, but that doesn't mean you're always going to blindly attack face. We're going to talk more about that as we get a little bit deeper into this video, but these are starter cards that are typically a bit more relevant to Zoro. We'll talk about some more that are specific to Luffy later on, but this next one's actually a card that's relevant to all red players, and that is 2-cost Sanji. So I want to talk a bit about Sanji right now because he's actually a very interesting card. Really quick, if you come from Dragon Ball Super, you know that taking life early on is actually very advantageous, but in One Piece, it's a bit different. So what Sanji is good for is getting you those lives to your hand when your opponent is playing in such a way that they're not going to be attacking your life. And that is actually the optimal way to play against red, is to not give them much life early on and to actually focus on their board. Because what red does very well through cards like Nami, Sunny, and Vivi, and other cards we'll see later, is populate a board really, really well. That's what red does. So if the opposing player doesn't control that board, doesn't keep that board under control, doesn't take the time to remove those resources, they're gonna get overwhelmed. They're gonna lose the game. That's essentially what's gonna happen there. So what Sanji's really good for is whenever your opponent is denying you those lives, he can take a life and then get an insane amount of power by doing so. So you're getting a bit of a card draw, and you're hitting for a big number, and now you're punishing your opponent for not giving those lives, and you're actually using that life as a resource to do more damage. But you do want to be very, very careful with Sanji, though. It's going to be pretty rare that I recommend using his ability more than once per game, because if you ever do dip too far low in life, especially by putting yourself there, your opponent could potentially, all in one turn, depending on what deck they're playing and what their board looks like, just ignore your board altogether and potentially go for game on you, especially if you're tapped out, don't have many cards in hand, whatever the case is. So you do want to be very careful about Sanji. I just wanted to point out the big benefits he has, because again, that strategy of not giving you life is a big deal, but don't get too careless using his effect, because again, we only have 5 life in this game. Every life is very precious, so you want to be very mindful of that. And then the other card I want to talk about that's pretty much applicable to both decks is Uta. She is a card that's going to pick up a vast majority of our threats from our drop area. Maybe not so much these ones, although sometimes you will pick up like a Sanji for a 2k counter, maybe sometimes a Sunny-kun if it's all you can play that turn, but she'll pick up some of the rush cards we'll see later. But yes, these are what I call our starter cards. Now you notice these are not cards that have rush, and that's for a specific reason that I'll talk about in a second. But yeah, these are cards you're going to start the game with. These are cards that are lower on your curve, besides Uta, but still, she's pretty good. And yeah, the thing about like cards like Nami and Uta and Red all together, and you'll hear a lot of people say, is that red doesn't really have a way to bolster its hand size. Red doesn't have like a jewelry Bonnie that can, you know, possibly be used multiple times in a game if your opponent can't clear it and then increase your hand size overall. Red doesn't have a card like Queen that can draw 2 and pitch 1. That's what you'll hear a lot of people say about red, but that doesn't mean that red has a super big hand size problem. Because again, you have cards like Nami and Uta that replace themselves, and what replacing itself means is that they find a card from another area, so when you play them, they're not a -1 to your hand. Even Sanji doesn't have to be a -1 to your hand when you're using the ability to take a life. And that's really important for maintaining your card advantage, both in your hand and on your board. You don't want to, like, you know, put too many eggs in one basket. You want to make sure you have a healthy mixture and you're not over committing to a board. And cards like Nami and Uta can help with that, because when you put them out, even if they get cleared, you still maintain that hand advantage and you can still play the rest of the game. That's really important. But that's what you hear a lot of people say about red, that they have a really big hand size problem. And that honestly comes down to the way you play the game. If you play intelligently, if you don't overcommit to a board and you prioritize playing these cards that replace themselves, you'll be in a pretty good spot. But now I want to talk about these cards in tandem with our rushers. So if we move these cards up a little bit, I'll grab the rushers. So we have, I guess like in cost order, we have 2 cost Rush Sanji, we have 3 cost Zoro, we have 5 cost Luffy, and we have 9 drop Shanks. So these are all of our cards that have Rush on them for the most part. And they're very important to the red strategy because, again, red is the aggressive color. This is the only color in the game that has a very big majority of rush or haste cards if you come from Magic. So these are very important. But why do I separate these? Well, I think a lot of good red players, what they do is they actually hold off on their rush cards for when they're absolutely vital. They won't just play a Sanji on 2 when they could play like a Vivi, because the rush is such a valuable element in this game that you can use for either dealing a late game damage or just dealing with a card on board that you have to swing into. We're in set 1 of One Piece. A lot of what you have to do in this game is swing into your opponent's board. And even though you're playing a red deck, you might just think, oh, I'm only going to swing face and ignore their board. That's really not how you win many games in One Piece. There are going to be times where that's the case, don't get me wrong. If you have an adequate amount of rushers to where your opponent's only had a certain amount of life and you can use all that rush to just win the game on the spot, that's great. But a lot of times, especially against good players, that's not going to quite cut it. So you got to use your rush intelligently to whittle your opponent's board down. That's another reason why I'm calling these cards up here starter cards, and these kind of are artillery in the back. So here's an example I want to present to you guys. Let's just say my hand is just these 4 rushers, right? Let's just say that. And then my board is something like Nami, Sunny, and Vivi. We're probably early on in the game at this point, and I have a fair amount of these rushers in my hand, but when I'm playing the game, I don't really want to play them immediately. So let's say, I guess a curve like this, maybe I'd be on like 6 Dawn if I've played all these throughout the game. Maybe this is like my turn 3. So I'm on 6 Dawn here. And with my current hand, I've got a lot of options no matter which leader I'm playing. I can play any of my, well, besides Shanks, I can play any of my rushers and just start going to town in their face, or I can play a bit more conservatively. If I have a 6-card hand like this, I want to conserve that. So what I can do instead, let's say, for example, I'm playing Zoro. I'll clip 1 to Zoro. That means all my characters have plus 1k. So to make Nami a threat, I'll make her a 3. To make Sunny a threat, I'll give him 1 to make him 5. And then to make Vivi an actual big threat, because she's base 5k thanks to my leader, I'll make her 7. And by swinging in this specific order, like probably swing 5 first, swing 5 second, swing 6, and then swing 7, that's 4 swings. That's going to put all of these characters in rest mode, where that's going to alleviate a lot of pressure from our leader. And even if we have like a high life total, alleviating pressure from the leader is not a bad thing, because outlasting your opponent is not a big or a bad thing at all. So having all of our opponent's attacks go to our characters, and we still have this nice size hand to apply more pressure the next turn on our 8 Dawn turn, that's a really good feeling. So that would be the most efficient use of our Dawn in that case. And again, that's another reason why you want to keep rushers in the back, because maybe some of these attacks went to characters, and then maybe the remaining attacks went to life. Let's say we attacked 2 characters, maybe got them off the board, and then swung life. Our opponent might be down to 2 or 3 life at that point, and that's where the rushers are going to put a lot more pressure on, because they're going to be able to attack immediately, where our smaller characters on the board got a lot of value. Obviously, that's not a super applicable play in Luffy, but if this Nami was the equipping Nami, you could do some similar stuff, or maybe instead of a Vivi, you'd have a Sanji on board. It's obviously all contextual, but that's just an example of what I mean by saving our rushers for the greater end game push. Now for the next thing I want to talk about as another section of this video, I want to talk about red's removal, because not only is red the most aggressive color in the game, but it actually has some of the best removal in the game, and that one of the big reasons for that is Jet Pistol. But I want to sanction this off into two kind of sections. So we have Jet Pistol and we have Nico Robin, and what I'm going to call these are the poppers. These are the cards that actually do the removing. And then we have cards like Otama, and then we have our 4-cost Law, and then we have Round Table. These are our power setters. So what Jet Pistol does is it can KO anything that has 6,000 power or less. Nico Robin KOs anything with 3,000 power or less. We can manipulate our opponent's power levels on their character cards by playing any of these cards. Now, typically Round Table is not going to pair with either of these. It certainly can, but a lot of times what Round Table is really going to be good for is just putting a really high cost character on your opponent's board down to 0 or negative power, because in this game, when a card goes to 0 power, it doesn't actually die. It actually goes negative in power. So let's say I'm playing against Kaido, for example, and they have a 9-drop 10k Kaido on board. I can use Round Table, put it to 0. Now just about any of my characters is probably going to kill that Kaido. My 1-drop Namis can potentially kill that Kaido. So that's what Round Table is great for in the removal sense. It doesn't just straight up remove something on its own, but it does allow you to punch into anything that's really giving you a problem. 8-cost Kid would be another great example of that. But now going back to the power setters and the actual removal cards. These cards are so powerful in combination, but they're only as good as your knowledge of the game. What I mean by that is, if you use any of these in combination at an inopportune time, it actually can cost you the game. And I've learned this from firsthand experience. Let's take the green matchup, for example. The biggest priority target for either an Otama Jet Pistol or a Law Jet Pistol is going to be your opponent's 8-drop Kid, that 8k that says you have to attack into that card. You can't attack into any other characters or your opponent's leader. But the green decks are going to put a lot of character cards on board that are going to be threatening to you. A big example of that is Basil Hawkins. Basil Hawkins is a really big threat, especially where in red you're putting out many character cards. They're going to be in rest mode, and then Basil can pick them off 2 or 3 at a time. So with that in mind, you might want to use your Jet Pistol on that Basil, but know their curve. Know that their next turn, they're probably playing that 8-drop, especially if you've used a Jet Pistol, because they're going to think it's safe to do so. Now, don't get me wrong, if you have 2 or 3 copies of Jet Pistol in your hand, don't be afraid to Jet Pistol that Basil Hawkins, but this is One Piece. We don't always have the luxury of having multiple copies of a card we need in our hand. So in the cases where you only have the one Jet Pistol and you happen to have the Otama or the Law, you probably want to save it for the situation where your green opponent plays the 8-drop Kid. So moral of the story there is just be very, very cognizant of when you're using your Jet Pistols and when you need to use them. And, if that 8-drop Kid or any other threat your opponent plays might just win them the game outright, you probably want to hold on to your 1 copy of Jet Pistol. Nico Robin, you'll find oftentimes gets less usage with either of these cards, but of course it can come up, -2 on something and then being able to KO a 3k or less, lets you KO any 5k or less in the game. Nico Robin, though, is a really good turn 2 for either of these leaders that just picks off blockers or just 1-cost cards that replace themselves. But again, whenever you're picking off a blocker with Nico Robin, that's really big value. But you can, of course, combo these in tandem if the situation calls for it. But now, if you remember a point I brought up earlier, you're playing red, you might think from other card games or just the way that all the rush works in this deck that you might just want to go straight for your opponent's face all the time. That is not correct. Don't think like that. These cards are super vital to red's success because in this game, board control is everything. So I talked about before, using the rushers to deal with your opponent's board if you have to. Use these cards as well. Just because you're playing red doesn't mean every single turn has to be an aggressive onslaught. So if it really benefits you to deal with your opponent's board, play that Law and then play that Jet Pistol, and now you've established a 5k, so you're establishing board presence, you're dealing with your opponent's board presence, your leader is still free to swing at any character or swing at life if the situation calls for it. But if you take away anything from this one section, let it be this: get into the mindset of, if you don't have a clear shot to win the game on that very turn, deal with your opponent's board if it's too overwhelming, because that is generally going to lead to a lot more success in One Piece than just going blindly at face. The next section I want to talk about for red is defense. Now we have Red Hawk, we have Radical Beam, we have Guard Point, and we have our 1-drop blocker Chopper. Now, what's really interesting is you'll see some red decks not play any of these. You'll see some red decks play 1 out of the 4 of these, 2 out of the 4 of these. Pretty rare that play 3 out of the 4 of these. But there really are pros and cons to playing each one that I want to go over for you guys here. Now let's start with Red Hawk. Red Hawk is very powerful in the sense that it gives you 4K counter and KOs of 4 or less. And what that's really good for is removing your opponent's low-cost blockers, because not only did you just defend a huge attack that might have saved one of your key character cards, but you just dealt with a blocker that's going to decrease the amount of defense your opponent has on their next turn. That is very powerful. But costing 2 in a red deck that wants to flood a board is rather costly. So Red Hawk, in my opinion, is going to come down to player preference. If you're the type of player that maybe wants to play red a bit more mid-rangey, which honestly will probably benefit you more often than not, because again, the name of the game is board control, Red Hawk can be very good. But I've seen a lot of more aggressive red lists that just forego Red Hawk altogether because they don't want to dedicate the two Dawn to it on defense, which also makes sense. So this, I would say, is more of a playstyle preference than anything. I don't think it's correct or incorrect to play Red Hawk or not. But now I want to talk more about Radical Beam versus Guard Point, because these are very similar cards. They're both 1 cost counters. The difference is Radical Beam gives you 2K counter unless you are at 2 or less life, in which case it gives you 4K for 1 Dawn. That is a very great rate. 1 for 2K is a fine, normal rate, but 1 for 4K is an incredible rate. Guard Point, though, kind of meets right in the middle and all the time gives you 1 Dawn for 3K counter. That is really solid, because if your opponent ever swings for like a 7K at your leader for 5 or at a character that costs 5, that's a great number for your opponent to swing at, but Guard Points get you out of that for 1 card and 1 Dawn. That's incredible. Now, why would you play one over the other? My personal opinion, I don't think Radical Beam is very good against good players. And it goes back to what we talked about before, where good players are going to starve red of cards. They're not going to give you life needlessly. And that's going to make Radical Beam way less valuable, because if you're not at that 2 or less life threshold, Radical Beam is just a 1 for 2. It's worse than all your 0 for 2Ks that you're just going to be playing in your deck normally. So for that reason, I think Guard Point is just a better coverall type of card against the field, because it's still solid against the not so good players, because it still gives you 3K for 1. That's still a good rate, and it's also better against the good players who are not actually going to give you that life early on. That's why I think Guard Point's better than Radical Beam, but of course, play whatever you feel is necessary for your local meta or for how you're experiencing the game. Chopper now is a card that I have seen a lot of red lists cut. I've seen a lot of red lists just forego all this defense and just go all gas. I do think there's still a lot of value in 1-drop blockers, because at the end of the day, it's a 1-cost card that deflects any like huge attack coming at your face or at a character that you need to live. And sometimes if you can just end a turn on like, rush card, 1-drop blocker, they're not gonna be able to deal with your board as effectively, which is a really nice thing. And I think the main difference between a blocker and any of these counter cards is that the blocker doesn't care about what power the card your opponent's swinging with has. It just cares about being able to survive or not. And that's gonna be matchup dependent. Of purple, really easy time killing 1-cost cards. Green can rest them. Blue can bounce this to your hand pretty effectively. But again, this is One Piece. This is not Dragon Ball Super, where your opponent always has the answer to everything possible. Especially if you've been having a back and forth grinding game with your opponent, it's quite possible that they've used the card they needed to clear this encounter earlier, or they just don't happen to have it. If they're blue, for example, you can tell if they've stacked their deck in the last turn or two so that they know what's on top of their deck for maybe playing a Marshall DT. That's more of a specific example. But I do still think there is value in the 1-drop blockers. Maybe you don't need to play 4 of them, but maybe having some number, again, just to say, like, here's my board of rested cards that's going to threaten you next turn, and then, bam, a defensive card that's going to stop any high-cost attacker if you can't deal with it. I do still think there's value. But overall, guys, that's going to end it up for my competitive guide to playing red. I hope I got into some of the nuanced stuff that you guys were wondering about. But, of course, if you have any questions, please do drop them down in the comments. I want to help you guys get better at this game. So, yeah, drop your comments down below. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one.